A tense courtroom becomes the battleground for a fiery clash between a defiant billionaire and a fearless black judge whose unshakable integrity leaves everyone questioning their assumptions. What will happen when justice takes the stand? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Nicole Harper adjusted her black judicial robe as she strode through the private hallway leading to her courtroom. Every step echoed with purpose, her heels striking the polished floor like a drumbeat of authority. Court staff and security officers greeted her with respectful nods, their faces a mix of admiration and relief. It wasn't just another day. This was the start of one of the most anticipated trials of the year. At the center of it all, Ethan Rhodes, the billionaire who'd made headlines for alleged financial fraud involving thousands of workers' pensions. As she reached the heavy oak doors, she took a breath. She wasn't nervous, but she understood the stakes. Ethan wasn't just wealthy, he was powerful. His money bought armies of lawyers, influence in high places, and media narratives tailored to make him look untouchable. But none of that mattered here, not in her courtroom. "Ready, Your Honor?" asked Charlie, her ever-reliable bailiff. Nicole offered a tight smile. "Always." Charlie pushed the door open and the courtroom buzzed with hushed conversation. Lawyers shuffled papers, reporters scribbled in their notepads, and members of the public craned their necks to get a glimpse of the woman who would preside over this case. The tension in the room was almost tangible, like the hum of an engine waiting to roar to life. Nicole stepped onto the bench, and Charlie called out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Nicole Harper." The room stood in unison, except for one man. Ethan Rhodes remained seated, leaning back in his chair as if he were on vacation, one arm draped lazily over the backrest. His sharp suit screamed custom tailoring, and the smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth suggested he was already bored. Nicole's eyes flicked to him briefly before scanning the room. She knew this moment would come. Men like Ethan had a certain playbook, and disrespect was always their opening move. The smirk, the slouch, the refusal to stand. It wasn't just arrogance, it was a challenge, a test to see if she'd rise to his bait. She didn't. Nicole tapped her gavel once, the sharp sound slicing through the murmurs. "You may be seated." The courtroom obeyed, the sound of chairs shuffling filling the air. Ethan didn't flinch, still lounging as though this were his private theater and she merely the entertainment. His lead attorney, a wiry man named Henry Caldwell, leaned over to whisper something, but Ethan waved him off without even looking. Nicole folded her hands on the bench, her gaze steady. "Mr. Rhodes," she began, her voice even and calm, "do you need clarification on court protocol? Or was your decision to remain seated a deliberate act of disrespect?" A ripple went through the courtroom. Even the stenographer paused for half a second before resuming her furious typing. Ethan's smirk widened. He straightened slightly but made no effort to stand. "Your Honor," he said, his tone dripping with mock politeness, "I didn't mean any disrespect. I just assumed my presence spoke for itself." Nicole's face betrayed nothing, though her eyes sharpened. "Let me be clear, Mr. Rhodes. In this courtroom, your wealth, your influence, and your assumptions have no bearing. Protocol exists for a reason. Consider this your first and only warning." For a brief moment, Ethan's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly, leaning back again. "Duly noted," he said with a shrug. Nicole turned her attention to the prosecutor, signaling for the case to proceed. Yet even as opening statement began, she could feel Ethan's eyes on her, studying, calculating. He wasn't used to hearing the word no, and she suspected it intrigued him as much as it annoyed him. As the hours passed, the courtroom settled into a rhythm. The prosecutor presented evidence methodically, painting a damning picture of Ethan's corporate dealings. On paper, he was accused of siphoning millions from pension funds to cover losses in his failing ventures. To the families of the employees who'd lost their life savings, Ethan wasn't just a criminal, he was a destroyer of futures. But Ethan sat there, unmoved. He doodled on a notepad, checked his watch, and occasionally whispered to Henry, who seemed increasingly agitated. To the untrained eye, he looked disengaged. But Nicole saw something else. Control. Ethan's nonchalance wasn't ignorance. It was a message. He wanted everyone to know he didn't care, because in his mind, this trial was just a minor inconvenience. During a brief recess, Nicole sat in her chambers sipping tea as she reviewed her notes. Her assistant, Meredith, entered with a stack of documents. "Looks like the media's eating this up," Meredith said, placing the papers on Nicole's desk. "Every outlet's running stories about the trial. Most of them are focusing on, well, him." Nicole raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess. They're spinning him as the misunderstood genius." "Pretty much. He's a risk-taker who pushed boundaries." Meredith rolled her eyes. "They're painting you as the underdog, though. The brilliant black judge holding the powerful accountable. It's flattering, but it's also exhausting." Nicole sighed. "They love a narrative. But this isn't about me or him. It's about the law." "Tell that to his PR team," Meredith muttered. When court resumed, the atmosphere felt different. Ethan's team began their defense, employing every tactic in the book to paint him as a victim of overzealous regulators. They leaned heavily on jargon, trying to confuse the jury and obscure the facts. Nicole watched silently, her face an impenetrable mask, but her mind was racing. She'd seen this strategy before, and she wasn't about to let it muddy the waters. Midway through the defense's presentation, Ethan made his second move. He leaned forward, interrupting his own attorney to address the courtroom directly. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice smooth and commanding. "I know this must be overwhelming, so much talk of numbers and regulations, but let me remind you, risk is what drives innovation. Without people like me, willing to take those risks, where would we be?" "Mr. Rhodes," Nicole's voice cut through the air like a scalpel, "you are not authorized to address the jury. Sit down." The room fell silent. Ethan hesitated, his face hardening. For a moment, it seemed he might argue, but something in Nicole's gaze stopped him. Slowly, he sat back, his jaw tight. Nicole adjusted her glasses. "This is not a stage for grandstanding, Mr. Rhodes. The jury will disregard his comments." The prosecutor seized the moment, hammering home the fact that innovation didn't justify exploitation. Nicole could see the tide turning, the jury's expressions shifting as they processed the evidence. By the end of the day, Ethan's smugness had dulled. He still exuded confidence, but there was a crack in his veneer. Nicole noticed it as he gathered his belongings, his movements just a fraction stiffer than before. "Good night, Mr. Rhodes," she said as the courtroom emptied. Her tone was polite, but there was an edge to it, a quiet reminder that she wasn't intimidated. Ethan paused, meeting her gaze. For the first time, his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good night, Your Honor," he replied, his voice devoid of its earlier smugness. As the doors closed behind him, Nicole allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The game had just begun, and she was ready for whatever came next. The next morning, the courtroom felt electric. Reporters jostled outside, microphones and cameras aimed at the entrance as Ethan Rhodes arrived in a sleek black car, flanked by his legal team. The media storm was in full swing, with some headlines praising Ethan's entrepreneurial genius and others lambasting him as the face of unchecked greed. Inside, the atmosphere was no less charged. The jury filed in quietly, their expressions a mixture of focus and exhaustion. Nicole Harper sat at the bench, calm and poised, exuding the quiet authority that had become her hallmark. Ethan was back to his usual antics, lounging in his chair like a king surveying his domain. His attorney, Henry Caldwell, began the day with a bold move, challenging the admissibility of key evidence. "Your Honor," Henry said, rising to his feet, "we contend that the prosecution's evidence regarding Mr. Rhodes' corporate transactions was obtained through improper channels. We move to have it stricken from the record." Nicole raised an eyebrow. "Improper channels, Mr. Caldwell? That's a serious accusation. Please, elaborate." Henry cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "The financial documents in question were acquired through a whistleblower who violated confidentiality agreements with Rhodes Enterprises. Such evidence, we believe, should be deemed admissible." Nicole leaned forward slightly, her sharp gaze fixed on Henry. "Mr. Caldwell, are you suggesting that protecting Mr. Rhodes' confidentiality outweighs the legal obligation to expose criminal activity?" Henry faltered, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for a response. Nicole let the silence linger for a moment before continuing. "I've reviewed the admissibility of this evidence thoroughly," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "The whistleblower's actions may have breached internal policies, but the evidence itself is both relevant and lawfully obtained by the prosecution. Motion denied." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Ethan's smirk flickered, and Henry sat down, his face flushed with frustration. Nicole's decision was a blow to their defense, and everyone in the room knew it. As the day wore on, the prosecution continued to methodically build their case. Witnesses testified about how Ethan's fraudulent schemes had devastated employees and retirees, their voices heavy with emotion as they recounted losing their life savings. The jury's expressions ranged from sympathetic to outraged, and even the courtroom spectators seemed to hang on every word. Ethan, however, remained impassive. He jotted notes, whispered occasionally to Henry, and occasionally glanced at the clock as if bored. Nicole watched him closely, noting every subtle twitch and flicker of annoyance. He was losing control of the narrative, and it was starting to show. During a break, Nicole retreated to her chambers. Her assistant, Meredith, followed her in with a laptop and a steaming cup of coffee. "Take a look at this," Meredith said, setting the laptop on Nicole's desk. "There's a trending clip from this morning. The pundits are dissecting every move you and Ethan have made." Nicole clicked play. The video showed a panel of commentators debating Ethan's behavior in court, with one particularly animated pundit declaring, "This trial isn't just about fraud, it's about privilege. Ethan Rhodes is the epitome of entitlement, and Judge Harper is the perfect foil. She's everything he's not, disciplined, focused, and principled. It's fascinating to watch." Nicole closed the laptop with a sigh. "They're turning this into theater." Meredith shrugged. "It kind of is, but hey, you're winning the audience." Nicole shook her head. "The audience I care about is in that jury box." The next witness was an accountant who had worked under Ethan at Rhodes Enterprises. A soft-spoken man with wire-rimmed glasses, he detailed how he had been pressured to falsify financial reports to hide the company's losses. "I was told to make it look like we were thriving," the accountant said, his voice trembling slightly. "When I questioned it, I was told, this is how the game is played, and if I didn't play along, I'd be out of a job." Ethan's expression darkened, and he leaned over to whisper furiously to Henry. Nicole noticed the interaction, but didn't let it distract her. She focused on the witness, her questions precise and incisive, drawing out the truth one detail at a time. By the end of the testimony, the jury looked visibly shaken. Ethan, on the other hand, looked increasingly agitated. His usual mask of indifference was slipping, and Nicole could see the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. During a recess, Ethan made his move. As the courtroom cleared, he approached the bench, his legal team trailing behind him. "Your Honor," Ethan began, his tone somewhere between charm and condescension, "may I have a word?" Nicole looked up from her notes, her expression neutral. "Mr. Rhodes, if you have something to say, you should direct it through your counsel." Ethan smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I just wanted to clarify that my actions yesterday, remaining seated, were not meant as a personal slight. I respect your position, truly." Nicole tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Noted, Mr. Rhodes. Is there anything else?" Ethan hesitated, clearly expecting more of a reaction. When none came, he gave a stiff nod and returned to his seat. Nicole watched him go, her expression unreadable. She knew his type all too well. This wasn't an apology. It was a calculated attempt to regain control. The climax came during the cross-examination of Ethan himself. The prosecution called him to the stand, and for the first time, his confidence seemed to waver. As the prosecutor fired off a series of pointed questions, Ethan struggled to maintain his composure. "Mr. Rhodes," the prosecutor said, pacing in front of the jury, "you claim that your risky investments were for the benefit of your employees. Is that correct?" Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. "That's right. I was trying to secure a better future for them." The prosecutor stopped and turned, holding up a document. "Then how do you explain this email in which you explicitly instruct your CFO to cut losses at any cost, even if it meant liquidating employee pensions?" The room fell silent. Ethan's face went pale and he stammered, That's not what I meant. It's taken out of context." Nicole's voice rang out. "Answer the question, Mr. Rhodes." Ethan glared at her, but he knew better than to argue. "I was trying to protect the company," he said through gritted teeth. The prosecutor pressed on. "And yet, in protecting the company, you destroyed the livelihoods of thousands. Tell me, Mr. Rhodes, do you believe your wealth makes you immune to accountability?" Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. The jury was watching him intently, their expressions a mix of anger and disbelief. Nicole tapped her gavel lightly. "Mr. Rhodes," she said, her tone calm but firm, "you may answer the question." Ethan's voice faltered. For the first time, the cracks in his facade were fully visible. "I didn't mean for things to get this far." The prosecutor seized the moment, delivering a closing line that hung in the air like a guillotine blade. "Intentions, Mr. Rhodes, don't erase the harm you've caused." As Ethan stepped down from the stand, his shoulders slumped. The courtroom buzzed with tension, everyone acutely aware that the trial had reached a turning point. For the first time, it felt like justice might prevail. Nicole adjourned the session, her gaze sweeping over the room one last time. The jury looked thoughtful, the spectators murmured among themselves, and Ethan sat silently, his confidence visibly shaken. As Nicole exited the courtroom, she felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The battle wasn't over, but the scales were tipping, and Ethan Rhodes was finally beginning to feel the weight of accountability pressing down on him. The courtroom was packed to capacity for the final day of the trial. Reporters filled every available seat, their pens and cameras poised to capture the conclusion of what had become a national spectacle. The jury had deliberated for 2 days, and now their decision would not only determine Ethan Rhodes' fate, but also set the tone for a broader conversation about accountability, privilege, and justice. Some people said Judge Nicole Harper entered the courtroom with the same calm authority she had maintained throughout the trial. Her presence, as always, commanded the room. "Arise," Charlie the bailiff announced. The tension in the air was palpable as the jury filed back into the courtroom, their expressions carefully neutral. Ethan sat at the defense table, his usual smug demeanor replaced by a mask of controlled anxiety. His fingers tapped an uneven rhythm on the table, and his gaze darted nervously around the room. Even his attorney, Henry Caldwell, looked worn, his suit rumpled from days of endless strategizing. Nicole surveyed the room before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreman, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense air, stood and cleared her throat. "We have, Your Honor." "Please hand the verdict to the bailiff," Nicole instructed, her voice steady. Charlie carried the sealed envelope to Nicole, who opened it with practiced precision. Her eyes scanned the document, betraying nothing, before she handed it back to Charlie. "Please read the verdict." The room seemed to collectively hold its breath as Charlie's deep voice rang out. "On the charge of fraud, we find the defendant, Ethan Rhodes, guilty." Gasps rippled through the spectators. Reporters scrambled to jot down the moment, while Ethan visibly tensed, his jaw clenched so tightly it seemed he might crack a tooth. Nicole's expression remained impassive as she raised her gavel. "Order in the court," she commanded. The room quieted immediately, all eyes on her. Nicole addressed the jury. "Thank you for your service. You are dismissed with the court's gratitude." As the jury filed out, Nicole turned her attention to Ethan, who now looked every bit the defeated man. "Mr. Rhodes," she began, her tone measured but firm, This court finds you guilty of fraud and holds you accountable for the harm you've caused to the employees and families who trusted you. Your actions have consequences, and this verdict is a reminder that no one, no matter their wealth or power, is above the law. Ethan's gaze dropped to the table, his shoulders slumping. His legal team whispered furiously among themselves, likely already planning their appeal. But Nicole wasn't finished. Sentencing will be scheduled for a later date, she continued. Until then, Mr. Rhodes is remanded into custody. Ethan's head snapped up at those words. Custody? He blurted, his voice sharp with disbelief. Nicole's eyes locked onto his. That's correct, Mr. Rhodes. You will be held without bail until sentencing. The courtroom erupted in murmurs once more, and Ethan's expression shifted from shock to barely concealed fury. Before he could speak again, Nicole's gavel came down with a resounding crack. Court is adjourned. As the courtroom emptied, Nicole retreated to her chambers. She let out a deep breath, the weight of the trial finally settling on her shoulders. Meredith entered a moment later, her arms full of files and her face lit with a triumphant smile. You did it, Meredith said, setting the files down on Nicole's desk. Well, the jury did, but you were incredible up there. Nicole gave her a small, tired smile. It's not about me. It's about the law. Still, Meredith said, leaning against the desk, you handled him like a pro. He was practically steaming when you denied bail. Nicole chuckled softly. He'll survive. It's time he learned that actions have consequences. Meredith nodded, but her expression turned more serious. You know this isn't over, right? His team will appeal, the media will spin it, and the public will debate this for months. I know, Nicole replied, her tone resolute. But that's out of my hands now. I've done my part. Outside the courthouse, the media frenzy was in full swing. Cameras flashed, and reporters shouted questions as Ethan was escorted to a waiting police car. His once flawless appearance was now disheveled, his suit wrinkled, and his tie askew. The image of power and invincibility he had cultivated for so long was gone, replaced by the stark reality of a man brought low by his own hubris. Meanwhile, Nicole exited through a side door, avoiding the chaos. She didn't need the spotlight. For her, the satisfaction came not from public recognition, but from knowing she had upheld her duty. She stepped into her car, her thoughts already shifting to the cases waiting for her next week. The story, however, was far from over. Over the next few days, the trial dominated headlines and social media. Clips of Ethan's courtroom behavior went viral, with many calling him the epitome of privilege and arrogance. Others focused on Nicole, praising her composure and fairness. Debates raged online, with some questioning whether Ethan's punishment was too harsh or not harsh enough. Nicole stayed out of the public discourse, but the impact of the case was evident. Several prominent figures in corporate America began reevaluating their practices, wary of finding themselves in Ethan's shoes. Advocacy groups seized the moment, pushing for stronger regulations and greater accountability in the business world. A week later, Nicole sat in her living room, sipping tea as she read a book. The hum of her phone interrupted the quiet, and she glanced at the screen. It was a text from her mother. "Proud of you, sweetheart. Your father would be too." Nicole's chest tightened with emotion. Her father, a civil rights attorney, had been her inspiration for pursuing a career in law. He had taught her the value of standing firm in the face of injustice, a lesson she carried with her every day. She texted back a simple reply, "Thank you, Mom. Love you." Ethan's sentencing hearing took place several weeks later, and the courtroom was once again filled to capacity. Nicole presided over the hearing with the same calm authority as before, her gaze steady as she delivered the sentence. 10 years in federal prison, along with restitution to the victims. Ethan remained stoic as the sentence was read, but Nicole could see the tension in his jaw and the slight tremor in his hands. For all his bravado, he was finally facing the reality of his actions. As the hearing concluded, Nicole addressed the courtroom. This case is a reminder that justice is not about wealth or power, it is about fairness, accountability, and the rule of law. Let this be a lesson to all who think they are above it. The law applies to everyone. The room was silent as her words sank in. Ethan was led away in handcuffs, his head bowed. Nicole watched him go, her expression unreadable.